Hello, everyone. Today I am with Mark Saban, and Mark is a Jungian analyst. He sees clients in Oxford and also enjoys teaching Jungian and post-Jungian studies. For the last 2 years, he has been employed as a lecturer in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies, University of Essex. Mark studied classics at Oxford and then worked for 20 years as an actor, performing all over the world, doing everything from Shakespeare to street comedy. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark, we want to get on to the two personalities of Jung, number one and number two, but could we start with Shakespeare and street comedy and how you got on to Jung and all of that?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, I mean, I was an actor and performer for, well, getting on for 20 years actually before I ever went anywhere near psychology, and weirdly, I had no particular, conscious interest in psychology or psychoanalysis before then, but I think. In retrospect, and I've thought about this a bit because I'm interested nowadays in the psychology of the theatre and what's going on in that. I think to be an actor and to be a performer at all, really, you have to have some kind of interest in getting under the skin of other people and working out how they tick. So that's the connection I've made. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I was acting in a small-scale touring company called the Medieval Players, and we played all over the world. We came to your part of the world, came to the Perth Festival a couple of times actually, and had a great time. But lots of other places as well. We were a kind of rough and ready physical comedy troupe, and out of that came a double act. Which we were just trying to make some money actually, and a couple of us went out on the street in Melbourne, in fact, and tried to earn a few pennies. And gradually, an act came together. And a Chinese guy who lived in Singapore saw us there and said he'd pay for us to go out to Singapore and perform for him at Christmas, because lots of companies in Singapore apparently have these huge Christmas events, and they bring in acts and musicians and all sorts of stuff to perform for their employees. And he thought that we'd go down well, so we said fine, yeah, that sounds great. So we'd do that. So we flew off to Singapore. And it was hard work. We were doing several shows a day, but we kind of honed the act and it got better and better. And then we went back to England, and we became an act called the Two Marks. If you're really interested, you can see us doing our stuff on YouTube even now. The other Mark is a guy called Mark Heap, who went on to have quite a great career in comedy on TV and some film as well. But yeah,
which is strange considering he was the less funny one out of you two.
yeah, well, I'm not sure he'd agree with you about that. Uh, we actually, it was an interesting act because we did a lot of juggling, because we'd learnt these skills in this theatre theatre company we were in, and so we employed a lot of juggling and stilt walking and stuff, but it was basically physical comedy. And when we went back to England, we started doing the alternative comedy circuit there, which was sort of this was in the kind of late 80s, I suppose, early 90s. And it went well, and we got bookings, and we supported some quite big people, and we went on television and so on. But after a while, to be honest, I started slightly losing the original zest and zing about the thing. It started, I realized it was no longer there. And I think what it was that acting and performing no longer somehow felt that it was feeding my soul, I think is the way I would put it now. It was great. I really enjoyed it, and we were quite successful in our way. But I picked up a book. I happened to be, of all things, doing a pantomime in Los Angeles. and which had Jar Jar Gabor as the fairy godmother. Believe it or not, it was Cinderella. Anyway, that's another story. So I picked up a book in a bookstore there, and it was by Thomas More, and it was called Care of the Soul. And I started reading this book, and it's something about that book just grabbed me. I thought this is really, really interesting. And then and I looked around. I tried to find some other things by him, and I realized that he was talking a lot about a guy called James Hillman. So I found all Hillman's books and I started reading them, and I got more and more excited about these ideas. And that led me onto Jung, and it led me ultimately to training as a Jungian analyst, and practicing as a Jungian analyst, and then, being interested in talking about Jungian psychology and teaching it and so on. And that eventually took me into the world of academia, where, as you said, I've been for a few years. Yeah, so I mean, nowadays I share my life really between academia and seeing my clients. So about half and half, really, which feels like a good mix, actually. But yeah, that was in a nutshell. That's the journey that got me here, talking to you.
So, I think of the Odyssey sometimes, where he had to go to all those different islands, and they were such
Yeah.
different experiences. I mean, from theatre to academia is quite a, it's quite a shift, really, isn't it?
It is. It is. I mean, there's a bit of performing involved in academia. Obviously, you have to stand up in front of a bunch of people and talk to them. So those skills have come in handy over the years, I
Yeah.
have to say. But yeah, no, very different, very different. And I feel, I feel as if I'm quite a different person. I dare say there are people who would tell you that I'm exactly the same person, but I guess I am, and I'm not. So yeah, no, but I think that kind of transformation, that kind of development requires one to go round some fairly peculiar twists and turns. And yeah, and so who knows? Maybe this isn't the end. Perhaps I'll
There'll be a
find
few
myself
more.
completely different in a few years.
um, and Mark, Jung's two personalities. How did you get onto that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think your point about the Odyssey is interesting, because in a way, what we have with Jung psychology, I think, in particular, I mean, some philosophies, some psychologies are kind of dreamt up in the heads of the people who create them. Psychology isn't really like that, because if you look at any of his key ideas and you trace them back, you can pretty well nearly always find a source for them somewhere in his life. He lives these things first, and then he writes about them, and then he thinks about them, and so on. And in this case, I was thinking about trying to write something. Actually, it was going to be my PhD thesis, and I wanted to write something about this what Jung calls the problem of the opposites. And I thought about that in all sorts of abstract ways. I spent a year kind of reading philosophers and linguists and all sorts of people writing about what opposites were. And I eventually realized that none of this had anything to do with what Jung was talking about when he talked about this problem of the opposites. But then I remembered something I'd written before about these two personalities and the experience, because in his memoir, as you say, he writes about, first few chapters is all about how he kind of wrestles with his experience having two different personalities: personality number one, personality number two. Personality number one is a kind of, I guess you could say, sort of ordinary personality. It's the personality of Jung as an ordinary little boy, and then a young person, and so on. It's Jung in the world, having relationships, going to school, being naughty, whatever. It's just everyday life of Jung. But then he's very aware that there's this other personality that he calls personality number two, and that personality is almost sort of almost transcendental. It connects to nature, it connects to the infinite, it connects to what he'll later realize are religious ideas, connects to what he describes as God's world, though he's not talking about a kind of limited sort of Christian idea of God there. He's talking about something much more cosmic, I think. anyway, when he's in that world, when he's in that personality, he feels like he's a million miles away from personality number one.
Mm.
And as the years pass, he swings between these two personalities, really. And sometimes he tries to live in personality number one, and that doesn't work. Sometimes he tries to live in personality number two. That doesn't work either. He can't live in personality number two because nothing happens. It's the infinite. It's the abstract. It's nothing develops, nothing changes in that world. So, but this is a real problem for him. He gets stuck in this place between these opposites, and he just doesn't know what to do about it. He has the odd inkling because sometimes, for example, when he's a teenager, he has to choose what work he's going to do, and he thinks about and he starts training as a doctor, and he looks into the idea of psychiatry, and when he thinks about psychiatry, he realizes that this is a place, and he describes this in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. This is where, as he calls it, the two streams could flow together. And what he means by that is it's a place which is on the one hand kind of scientific and precise and evidence-based and so on. That's personality number one. But it's also it's in touch with the deepest recesses of the psyche of the patient and indeed of the doctor. And that is something which definitely comes into personality number two. So here he finds a place there where the opposites can come together there. But it's a struggle for him always to manage this really strong tension between these two different aspects of himself, and eventually he has this extraordinary dream called the Storm Lantern Dream. I won't describe it in any detail, but he comes out of that dream anyway, realizing that the only way forward is to live a life where you have to exist in personality number one, because that's the bit of you that will enable you to work, have a family and have a career and be in the world, have relationships. But you should never ever forget personality number two. That has to be absolutely present as well. And there is a tension between the two, but that's okay. That's a creative tension, and it's out of that tension that the idea that he later develops is the idea of individuation, obviously, and individuation flows out of the tension of opposites. He says it flows out of again, an idea he comes up later is the idea of the transcendent function, and the transcendent function is all about the necessity to bring together the opposites in such a way that something new can come out of it, that you gain a new perspective on the world, which is not can't be reduced to either of the original perspectives or the original places, the original opposites. It's a new thing, and it takes you forward for a while until you meet up with the next set of opposites, and so on, and so it goes on. But that's individuation, and I think all those ideas, and especially the idea of individuation, really flowed out of this powerful experience he had as a child, and his realization that you need to keep both things together, even though that's uncomfortable.
Mm. Sometimes I think about, in terms of my own experience with Jung, is like the number two personality has been very repressed.
Yeah.
And that my first kind of, what is it? The first thing maybe I loved about Jung in retrospect is that it kind of allows for your number two personality. Those things, if you're a bit of a dreamer in the farming community of Western Australia, they were very practical people. So it kind of legitimized the number two personality, or the things which one was a little, they seemed peculiar. But it's like materialism and rationalism and all of that seems to have kind of tucked it away somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so I mean, I think that's a very important point, because Jung is not only doing this, as it were, for himself. He doesn't only see it in terms of the individual psyche. He also sees it in terms of something that's going on out in the culture. So, Western European culture, as he comes to see it, is very one-sided in the direction of, as you say, rationalism, materialism, and so on, and the values, if you like, of personality number two have been lost, really, or certainly shunted off into the margins and considered to be unimportant. Yeah, I think the whole of Jung psychology is basically pointing to that problem and seeking to try and do something about it. So he isn't just, I mean, one way to do that, something about it, is obviously to work on the individual level, but he's also saying that needs to happen culturally as well, needs to happen on a wider scale, and that's why he writes about much bigger cultural problems in these terms as well. So yeah, absolutely, and I think that's why inevitably there is such an emphasis on personality number two stuff in Jung psychology, because yeah, I mean, he's drawn as a person. I mean, he's naturally introverted. He values this stuff as an individual anyway, and he's pulled in that direction. But he also feels the need to emphasize that side in order to compensate for this one-sidedness that we're talking about now. So as a result, Jungian psychology, goes very big on the whole number two side of things, and arguably, possibly, perhaps slightly underplays the personality number one side of things. One of the things I argue in my book is that although all that is entirely understandable, and one can see exactly what Jung's doing and why he's doing it, the outcome of that can be that things like bearing in mind outer relationships, one's the everyday life, the life of society, the life of political life, and so on, can sometimes it can sometimes seem, if you're reading Jung, that stuff is just unimportant. You don't need to worry about that. You just need to concentrate on your inner development and so on, and stay with personality number two. And I don't think that is really, or can be really, what he means if we go back to this idea of individuation, because it's always about bringing in the thing that's been left out, if you see what I mean. So although society as a whole and Western culture as a whole has left out this stuff, and therefore it needs to be brought in, that's an excellent point, and Jung makes it again and again. It's also true that within Jungian psychology, as a tradition, I think the outer stuff has been left out. So the personality number one stuff tends to be a bit left out. That then needs to be brought in again, because this is a process. Obviously, it never stops. We never reach a point to say, all right, Jung said everything there is to say about everything. We don't need to think it, or we'll just, quote Jung. That I don't think Jung for one moment wanted that to be the case. The whole idea of individuation is that we all find our new, our ways forward, our new perspectives, and that means change all the time, transformation. And that means that Jungian psychology needs to transform as well, because nothing stays the same. That's anyway
just
the
going,
kind of
yes,
book, yeah.
Yes. Do you think Hillman? When Hillman went through that phase of we've had 100,000, not 100,000 years of
quite that long.
psychotherapy, but 100 years. But it's that psychology needed to come out of the consulting room, and
Yes.
it wasn't just confined to the consulting room and the street. And was he kind of saying the same thing as what?
I think he's pointing to the same problem. Yeah. I think so. I think he's very aware that I think Hillman's a really good example of someone who refuses to let things stay stuck. He's constantly pushing against received wisdom on this, or so I mean, of course Hillman himself was very much a Jungian. He was the director of studies at the Jung Institute in Zurich. That's the key position at the very, very heart of the most established institution in Jungian psychology. So he knew what he was about, he knew what he was up against, and he then starts pushing against it. He has this kind of this need almost to cause trouble, I think, and he will do that in whatever direction he looks, really, and that's incredibly valuable, because even though, I mean, I don't think one necessarily has to agree with Hillman about everything, because then you fall into the same problem again. Obviously, Hillman hasn't said everything there is to say about everything. So,
Yeah.
but we need to follow his example rather than necessarily agreeing with everything he says, because he doesn't let things stick. He challenges all the time, and
We
and
should
that's
worship at the altar of perturbation.
yes, exactly.
It's kind of like it's good for our ossified and fixed
Yeah.
ideas and things.
Exactly. Anything exactly. As soon as because the ideas have a really awful tendency to get fixed very quickly. So stuff that Jung's coming up with in the after his confrontation with the unconscious, then the ideas really start flowing out. He describes it as like lava, emerging out of a volcano or something, and he's having to really rush to try and turn these ideas into something that he can write down and get out there to the public. But these are genuinely new ideas. This is happening in the moment, and it's very, very exciting. But within a generation, in Zurich, and Jung slightly contributed to this, it has to be said, you've got an establishment, you've got a group of people who are who basically worship at the altar of Jung, and everything Jung says is right, and of course Jung was a pretty impressive guy, so it's understandable and extremely charismatic and all that, but that itself is dangerous. And so these ideas almost immediately start being laid down as the facts, the dogma. This is how it is. And that is exactly the problem that Hillman then inherits and tries to do something about in his own way. The trouble is, of course, that archetypal psychology, which is what Hillman calls what he's doing, that itself has the capacity to also become a dogma as well. And then you've got people at the Pacifica Institute, for example, who reproduce Hillman's ideas as if now this is the way things are.
This is the new dogma.
And new, all, and this is exactly the point at the heart of this idea of avoiding one-sidedness, which is at the heart of Jung's idea of individuation. So if we stay with the idea is this, I think the important thing is to stay with this notion, this transformative notion of individuation, and see what comes, because you have to be really vigilant and pay attention to what's being left out. And the telltale sign is you start feeling comfortable. As soon as you start feeling, you've established a kind of comfort zone with your ideas. You say, "Oh yes, now I understand. Oh yes, yeah, Jung was right about this, or Hillman's right about this, and now I can see. As long as I read these books and keep reminding myself what these people say, this is I've taken up a really clever perspective now on things." And that's incredibly dangerous, because you're immediately doing exactly what you shouldn't do. You're excluding all the possible challenging things that might make things painful and difficult again. It goes back to your point about Odysseus. Odysseus has to go through those incredibly difficult trials in order to get back home. That's the only way. There isn't any other way to do it. It's a kind of sinuous, journey of wrong turns and mistakes, and getting it wrong, and feeling you've got it wrong, and that is the only path. That's as soon as you start thinking, "Oh yeah, I've got it now, I'm there," that is the telltale sign that
as soon as you start saying, "I am individuated,"
No, exactly. And
it's not only a telltale sign; it's a red flag.
it certainly is. Yeah, I mean yeah, exactly. And the terrible thing is that in those early days in Zurich, people did say things like that. They really were going around saying, "Oh yes, so and so, Doctor so and so, he's individuated." I think nowadays people wouldn't unlikely to say that, but they might well think it or feel it. So it's exactly, that is absolutely a red flag.
So you're when you're talking about individuation, you're talking about an ongoing process,
Yes,
and it
all
has to
process.
do process, and it has to do with two opposites combining into a third, a new third kind of thing, which is a strange
Yeah,
combination of both opposites, maybe.
I mean, yes, I would slightly quibble with the word combine because that makes it sound a bit too easy almost,
Yeah.
because you don't just add one opposite the other and then you've got the synthesis kind of thing. It's not that. That's not. Uh, Jung emphasizes the difficulty of this and the tension between them, because if they really are opposites, it means they're felt to be opposites, which means you can't possibly put them together. So that kind of really difficult, um, uh, Jung uses, as you know, Jung loves alchemy, and he loves using alchemy as a metaphor for psychic transformation. And he is particularly attached to this figure of Mercurius, which is very much at the heart, I think, for Jung of this what we're talking about now, this process of individuation. But Mercurius is often imaged as a hermaphrodite. And if you look at some of those pictures, alchemical pictures of Mercurius, they're pretty peculiar. And you get a really kind of strange combination of really monstrous, actually, to be honest,
Mm,
really
mm,
hard to look at in a way. And I think that expresses how difficult this is.
mm,
It's not an easy process to bring these opposites together.
mm,
They really don't want to be next to each other,
mm,
but if you can manage it, then and again, what he means is if you can stay out of your comfort zone for long enough, something interesting might come out of that. Some new thing might come out, a perspective which is not just a combination of the two of them, but something genuinely new.
mm. Yeah,
I think that's the point.
yeah. And what happened when you were writing your book? I mean, did you underwent a bit of a change in your thinking uh, um, as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I mean, there were several factors really going on. One was that I started with this rather uncontroversial. Well, I thought it was uncontroversial idea of just writing. What does Jung mean by the opposites? Let's look at that. Look at examples. Ah, yes, now and here it is. I thought it would be that would be well. I knew it would be difficult, but I didn't think it would be controversial. As I went along, and the more I looked at certain aspects of Jung psychology, and also when I looked at the way in which Jung worked with his clients, I think that was probably one of the main things. I realized that there were one-sidednesses in Jung and therefore in the psychology to a certain extent, which were problematic. And I was concentrating there on the clinical aspect of things. I think that was where it showed up most clearly. I mean, Jung had a client called Christiana Morgan. The so-called vision seminars are an account of seminars he did several years after he worked with Christiana Morgan, and he's in Zurich talking to his colleagues about the case and the she had various visions and did a lot of drawings, and they talked their way through these things. But the original case with Christiana Morgan, we know quite a lot about because she kept quite a lot of notes, and it's quite with a modern eye, it's quite shocking looking back at what happened in that analysis, because Jung seems to be really very unaware of the kind of transference stroke countertransference dimensions of what's happening. And he's really emphasized. I mean, he says to Christiana Morgan quite early on, what you need to do is do exactly what I did. You need to um, keep a book and have visions and do active imaginations and draw it all and write it all down in the big book, and exactly like his red book, in effect. And so she does this, and he starts off saying how marvelous it is and how wonderful it is and how she's creating this marvelous archetypal archive for the future of humanity. So he kind of inflates her hugely at the beginning, saying how marvelous she is. On the other hand, he's also saying to her that her goal should be to, because she's got a partner who's in Zurich at the same time, and he's saying that her goal should be to become a kind of support for him. That should be her ultimate goal. And in other words, be his anima, act out his anima as much as you can. And as we know, this is the kind of thing that really Tony Wolff was doing for Jung at around, slightly earlier, around the same kind of time. And there are, I find, there are all kinds of problems with this stuff. It felt to me out of whack. It felt and what happens in the analysis is that it kind of goes wrong fairly quickly, not altogether surprisingly, and he ends up being quite critical of her and attacking her. And there's an excellent book by Claire Douglas, if anyone wants to read more about this, called Translate This Darkness, which looks at the analysis and looks at Christiana Morgan's life. She's a very interesting woman, but it goes horribly wrong. And eventually he says, well, I think you should stop all this analysis now and go away and get married and have a baby, then you'll be okay. And that's that. Now, obviously, it doesn't make sense to import 21st, what century are we in? 21st century ideas back into, but it wasn't that long ago. We're talking about the 1920s.
Yeah.
But anyway, the central point here, I felt, was that Jung is out of whack in terms of he's not practicing this notion of individuation fully. He's not bringing in the what the troubling aspects of this, the stuff that's been excluded, and he's not allowing it to work analysis. And particularly, he's not actually practicing what he says analysis is all about. If you read his Psychology of the Transference, he's very clear that in analysis, deep analysis, the analyst and the patient need to be both in there completely. They need to be both very engaged on a very deep level, and that means paying close attention to all the relational things that are happening within the analysis. And that's exactly what he seems to be not doing in this analysis. So I think it seemed to me that the Jungian psychology as a whole sometimes highlights and emphasizes, and this was what Jung was doing with her stuff, emphasizes the so-called archetypal aspects of it, and doesn't pay enough attention to the so-called personal aspects of it. And I think what Jung was really...
And are you saying, sorry, are you saying some of the number one personality aspects of
because in a way the
nuts and bolts?
Exactly. Yeah, the everyday personality, the stuff that the ordinary stuff you're feeling when you're in analysis, and that could include, that your feelings about the analyst and so on, and that actually matters quite a lot, and that needs to be worked with. If your analyst is only insisting on talking about the archetypal nature of your dreams or your active imaginations, that gets missed out. And it seems to me that dimension of the analysis is just as important. I'm not saying that one should just concentrate on the personal. In a way, that's what psychoanalysis does. It gets into that nitty gritty, and it's all about what did mummy and daddy do, and what happened in the first 3 years of your life, and so on. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the number one aspect of yourself, and the number one aspect of the analysis being as important as the number two aspect of the analysis. And when that happens, again, as Jung tells us, something interesting happens, something new can come out of that. But if you highlight only the archetypal aspect of it, you've missed that. and just as much if you only concentrate on the personal stuff. So that's my kind of that's where I got to. I realized, and then I started realizing that I was actually saying something that might be considered a bit controversial, and later on I realized it was because some Jungians don't like to hear anything remotely critical of Jung, and even though I was basically my basic argument is to say Jung's central insight here about individuation and the need to bring the opposites together is the most crucial thing in it, and if we can do that with his own psychology, or when we're looking at Jung, then we'll be doing something which is absolutely in tune with Jung's psychology. Even though, in other words, I was bringing, if there was a critique of Jung, it was a kind of internal critique. I was using Jung to critique Jung. That was the point. But even so, I've done talks with people, and I remember I did a talk for a New York Jungian training, talking about these ideas and about my book, and a very eminent Jungian analyst, a woman, her first question to me was, "Why do you hate Jung so much?"
Yeah.
And you know,
yeah,
clearly it was nowhere near. I mean, I am a Jungian. I am a
Yeah.
Jungian. I practice as a Jungian analyst. I teach Jungian psychology every week. I'm completely absorbed by it, and I love Jung, but it's exactly because I love Jung that it seems important to keep this thing alive in a way that, as I said, avoids falling into this static one-sidedness.
Couple of things. I mean, the first thing is I'd suggest don't do any outdoor rallies at the moment, Mark, because that will keep you safer. I know I shouldn't be that directive, but there we go. The other thing is
good advice, I think. Yeah.
The other thing is it's complicated though, isn't it? Because I was speaking to someone the other day, Michael Vanoy Adams. And I can see where he's coming. Like, when it comes to politics, like I'd rather ask the questions because I don't have any answer to it. But it seems to me that I can see both points of view with regards to politics. That I can see this thing that, if I was a therapist and I was trying to influence people politically, I see that as a bit of a no-no in one way, like that you should vote Democrat or something like that. And then if I was all if someone was all archetypal with no political acuity at all, well, then that would also seem a little bit strange. But then there's a variety of other things. Like, for example, well, what does it really matter if you're a bit more number two? Like, there's always been rishis and saints and sadhus in India and all of that, and religious people maybe or whatever. But then again, I can see the stultification. No, what is the word? Stultification. That something like that. It was similar to that, which can happen when there's no what is it? Juice between the inner and outer.
Yeah.
And you can still say, like, we live in a heavy politicized. This is just the last thing. We live in it's heavily politicized. Every time I turn on my computer in the morning, I see Trump's face just about, and which seems hard for me to believe. So some of the problems of being in a kind of an overly politicized environment still, do you know what I'm getting at?
There's a few points there. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is I would say, I mean, what I'm talking about here is, in a way, the kind of institution of Jungian psychology and the individuation of that. What I'm not saying is that and the need for Jungian psychology to stay alive to what's being left out, and just stay in touch with that in order to avoid this stultification thing. when it comes to individuals, I'm working with individuals every day. Individuals are, really are all different, and what you're not, what individuation isn't about is getting everyone into a kind of nice middle place where there's, a bit of that and a bit of this, and it's all balanced. I don't think that's the point at all. It's not that. But it is, as you say, because one could easily imagine someone whose whose individuation requires them to go and live on the top of a mountain and meditate for
25 years.
Yeah, exactly. And that that could happen. I'm not I'm not in the business of telling people they shouldn't do that at all. But I can also imagine that being a wrong step for someone, and a way of avoiding stuff. Now, I'm not saying, it certainly, it could be either. It could be that that's exactly what that person needs, but it can very often be, the path that people take is often, and this is when it's an ego thing, obviously, not something to do with the self as a whole. And there you, and again, that would be a way of choosing a kind of comfort zone. Not my comfort zone, sitting on the top of a mountain for 25 years, but in a way it would be, because you'd be successfully avoiding the stuff that you need actually to push you along your Odysseus-like journey to get you onto the next problem, and so on. Yeah, I mean, the politics thing. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's as we've already established. I mean, I think that the left has just as much a capacity to get stuck, to be one-sided, and as the right. And what does a country need? Well, it needs input from, as soon as you get these kind of bubbles, basically, as soon as you get bubbles, and again, we're back in comfort zones, the bubble of the left, the bubble of that comfort zone, and the bubble of the right, that comfort zone, you got real problems, because it's exactly the coming together of these conflicting comfort zones, which is where anything interesting or new can happen. So it needs to be taken account of. You can't just say, oh well, they're all fascists and therefore we don't need to even think about them, they're the deplorables, never mind that, we'll just concentrate on our base. Because that's not going to work in the long term. Might win you an election, possibly, although who knows, but it's not going to long term. You've got a country of people there, something has to bring people together. There has to be a sense of community, and there has to be a sense that you are sharing something important, and that's really hard when you've got such, obviously, I'm just talking the obvious really here, but when people are so far apart, that's a hell of a problem. Yeah, and I don't know the answer to it, but I accept that.
I just think that theoretically it fits with what you're saying about one-sidedness on either side, and just, in a way, it's always the theory between opposites, which is something we know are not ever easy, are they? But
exactly,
it's a kind of a what is it? A principle of looking at things sometimes.
I think it is. I think it's about perspective. It's about. Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I think Hillman is quite good on that. I mean, he talks about soul and all these psychological words. It's all about the way you see things, really. It's all about changing the way you see things. That's where the transformation happens. If you can change the way someone sees things, then all the other changes come with that, really. So I think that is key. Yeah.
And Mark, I wanted to ask you about something else. Spirit of the Times, which is maybe a little related to what we were just talking about. Spirit of the Times and Spirit of the Depths.
Yeah.
Because you go into that in your book as well.
Yeah. I mean, what I see in Jung's development, I mean, because one of the great sort of mistakes, I think, with Jung is to take, and this is partly encouraged by the way the collective works is laid out, because it's kind of organized roughly according to topic. So you get, so if you get something like the book on that I was talking about earlier on the psychology, on psychotherapy. There's a whole volume of the collected works 16, which is just about different stuff that Jung wrote about psychotherapy. And there's a mixture of stuff. There's stuff from very early stuff, there's stuff from very late, and it's all just sort of lumped in together, really. And you have to do, the reader has to do the work of thinking, oh, hang on, he's saying that back then, but then that doesn't seem to quite fit with this, and so on. But the general way in which you're supposed to swallow Jung psychology is just think, oh, this is just one thing. And he said this, he came up with this psychology, and here it is, and it's all one thing. And I think that if you look closely at Jung psychology, you see it changes quite a lot. Even, and I don't just mean, I mean, obviously it changes, after his confrontation with the unconscious. The stuff he writes when he's with Freud is different in all sorts of ways, although they're the seeds of his later psychology there, and so on. The very early stuff is a bit different, but everything from about, certainly from Psychological Types is 1921. Everything from about 1920 onwards, right the way through to the end of his life, is often considered to be just one idea, really, in lots of different ways. But I think there's a big change over that period. And when he writes the Red Book, which is where he talks about the spirit of the times and spirit of the depths, I think that one of the things that changes is the way in which he thinks about the opposites, and especially the opposites of inner and outer, the inner world and the outer world. Because in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, there's a place where he says, back then, at that time, at the time of the confrontation with the unconscious, I didn't yet understand what I later, the insight I later gained about the way in which the inside and outside were intimately related and intertwined. And so early on, the idea, the spirit of the times, that's all superficial stuff. That's politics. That's stuff that's going on the surface. No, that's not important. The important thing is spirit of the depths, and that's going on this deep level. It's what he later will call the archetypal realm, and so on.
Yeah.
But the implication is that you're best just ignoring that superficial stuff and concentrate on the inner stuff. Later on, I think that idea changes a bit, and I think he's gets much more interested in how these two things are intertwined and interrelated, and that in a way they're kind of two sides of the same coin. But obviously that this connects to everything else I've been saying about the need to bring the opposites together. And I think that he tries to do that in his late psychology in various ways. He does it in his writings on alchemy, because alchemy is one of those places where you're not only kind of psychologically working through what's happening, you're actually doing it. You're not only the alchemist outside of the vessel, adding chemicals and seeing and heating it up. You're also, the alchemists say, in the vessel. It's happening to you as well. And so there's synchronicity, and the idea of synchronicity is based on this notion that there is a kind of unus mundus where inner and outer, material, spiritual, archetypal, personal, all these stuff are really all one. It's a kind of spectrum, really, and it's just in different places on the spectrum. And again, that challenges this notion. So I think there are various ways that Jung, and yes, the other place would be in the psychology of the transference again, where he makes it clear that the stuff that's going on in you and the stuff that's going on in the room with the client and in the there's this sort of third place between you where which is neither you nor them, and it's something else again. All these ideas challenge this idea that there is, that you can separate these things out in that way. So yeah, I can't remember what your original question was now, but the Yeah, Spirit of Time, Spirit of the Depths. I think that those the Red Book insight, and obviously those were the insights he needed at that time. I mean, it's a process again, and he needed to work his way through look at those things in those ways at that point. But as he doesn't stop developing, he doesn't stop transforming, and his ideas do change. And later on, I think there's much more, as I say, of this emphasis on the way in which these opposites are, in fact, in some ways, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about enantiodromia, because I think, there's one thing about one-sidedness is it seems to me it's so dynamic that one side can be dominant at one stage and there's a swing,
Yeah.
but then the other side can become dominant almost. And then, it's kind of a fast moving.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think that's a really useful insight. I mean, he gets the idea from Heraclitus, who comes up with this notion of enantiodromia. But what Jung does with it is make it into a kind of psychological insight, which is basically that, yeah, if you get sufficiently one-sided, eventually things will get so heavily weighted that there'll be a huge swing right across to the other end. And I think one of the examples he gives is St. Paul, who has this falls off his horse and has this moment where he sees the divinity of Christ and so on, and again, clearly he goes from one end, he's a baddie, he's persecuting the Christians and so on, and then the next moment he's so there's a total shift from one end to the other. I'm sure we could come up with lots of other examples if we thought about them, but of course the problem with that is that doesn't really work. You don't want to be sliding across huge. I mean, these massive shifts only happen if you're so one-sided in the first place. You don't really want to be undergoing these kind of enantiodromic shifts ideally, and of course, as always, really,
it's kind of like I would relate that to when he talks about fate. It's like if one, well, using a bit of jargon, if one becomes so unconscious in a sense that one becomes very one-sided, then fate will come up and
no, exactly. That's exactly what he's saying. Yeah, exactly what he says. That's right. That I mean, if you're that unconscious, then everything that you've excluded from conscious, everything you've pushed into the unconscious, everything you've projected, because that's the other thing you do if you don't want to be conscious, all that will come back and bite you in the bum basically eventually. Because that's fate. That is what it'll come back in the form of fate, is what he says, as you rightly say. And there's no way around that. And of course, all this is true not only for individuals, again, but for cultures as well. If you get sufficient, and that's one argument. You could say that the kind of evil irrationality of the Nazis, was something that came out of that, was a swing across into irrationality from a period where the rational and the scientific and the reasonable had been, everyone thought
dominant.
Before the First World War, oh, we've got there now. We've arrived. This is we are now in a perfect state of rationality, and we're going to understand everything, and there'll be no more evil and no more with this, that, and the other. And then you get this massive, great swing into the evils of Nazism. And that's one way of looking at it anyway. So I mean, yeah, it's dangerous. I mean, it's bad enough when it's happening to you, but when it's happening to your culture, that's serious stuff. And I think in the post-war period, we've got used to a kind of this sort of rather safe sort of consensus sense that, oh well, we all roughly agree about most things, don't we? And then the wall came down. And look, now even the East, even Eastern Europe, they agree with us too, and we're all, eventually the whole world, we're all going to agree about everything. Well, that idea didn't last that long. And we're kind of reaping the benefits of all that at the moment everywhere you look, basically. So yeah, this stuff is serious stuff, and yeah, it feels a bit bleak at the moment, but if there is if something good can come out of it, it's going to be in the realm of finding ways to hold these opposites together again, I think. And I'm not a politician, and I have no or a political thinker, so I don't know how that's going to happen. But it's the only way forward, it seems to me. And I think what we haven't emphasized yet is the idea that of some kind of dialogue, because when Jung, the example Jung gives of the transcendent function is him doing active imagination, and when he does active imagination, that's his ego, his conscious ego, in conversation with the figures that come out of the unconscious, and he talks to them, and he doesn't know they agree with them, and they have arguments, and and he sees all sorts of stuff, and he's shocked by and so on. But what comes out of that is a new way of seeing things, and that some kind of communication, some kind of dialogue, I think, between these different positions has to occur. And we don't know where it's going to go, because if we knew that, then it wouldn't be a genuine dialogue, and it wouldn't be a genuine process. So,
but I think also it's, to me, that's a kind of another principle, the dialogue between conscious and unconscious, but the dialogue between all the opposites being such a, I don't know, foundational idea.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's absolutely central, I think. Yeah. It's
And
really.
Which is kind of what you're doing in terms of, it seems to me, with regards to Jung's work, this dialogue between personality 1 and personality 2 is kind of it's the same idea.
I know, and actually, I was looking. I mean, I wrote the book, and I think 2019. I think it came out, so it's a while ago. So I was looking back at it in preparation for this conversation, actually, with you, and I noticed that there I make the point that this dialogue between the two personalities for Jung, is obviously what I'm writing about in a way, but I'm engaged in writing the book. I'm engaged in a dialogue with Jung, my Jung, and I'm setting myself up as different from Jung, and then we see what happens when we talk. And that's actually a very creative process. It's not, I don't necessarily get somewhere that everybody, that's, and to a certain extent, that's my process, obviously, because again, it's always personal as well as anything else. This is something that I had to go through probably for my individuation, maybe. But hopefully it's helpful on another level as well. But it's not necessarily, that's the other reason why not everyone's going to agree with it, because they have a different relationship with Jung, and different things are going to come out of that, and that's fine.
Well, it's kind of weird that they always, well, he always said, like, what is it, thank God I'm not a Jungian. And if you individuate, like, no two people can be the same, and we all kind of know that. But then if you veer off the Jungian dogma, then people still don't like it.
That's fine. Yeah, exactly. It's absolutely true what you're saying there. I mean, it's really important, I think, that we all hold these sort of truths as somehow, preeminently obvious or central to. But you're right. In practice, it doesn't really, it's not what you see actually when you actually start looking. So I think that's every now and again someone needs to remind everyone that that's the case, I think.
There's a lot of great stuff in your book, Mark, and that has made me think a lot about a lot of different things. Just before we go, is there anything else emerging? Are you writing anything at the moment?
I haven't got much time to write at the moment, but I'm just at the point of beginning to put together a few ideas. And yeah, I'm not sure I can say anything particularly coherent about it. I realize
Has it come out of this last book though, or is it?
Yeah, it's definitely a continuation of the same. I mean, I think I think somebody someone once said that we've only got at best we've only got sort of one idea in us. So basically, you keep thrashing one idea and see what comes out of it. So I think it's got a bit more juice in it left, and yeah, I mean, the idea that I tell you, the idea that excites me at the moment is the idea of, and it is in a way a continuation, is a notion that I found in a French philosopher, actually, a guy called Gilbert Simondon, and he did read Jung and was interested in Jung. He wrote a big philosophical work in the 50s on individuation, and he extends the idea of individuation. He says that everything individuates. There's material individuation. There's animals are individual, plants are individuating. There's psychic individuation in humans, but there's something also. There's another level, and it's trans individuation, is what he calls it, trans individuation. And what he means is that individuation of individuals doesn't stop there. There's a collective individuation that is the next stage, as it were, of individuation, and it seems to me that in the light of everything we were talking about earlier in terms of politics and the sort of rather awful state of things at the moment, it seems quite important to think individuation, just the little individual, and think about what that really might mean in a wider sense.
Very important theme, I would think. Very important topic. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you.
All right. Real pleasure. Yeah.
Have a good evening over there.
Thank you very much for your very stimulating and interesting questions and comments. Yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.